This time on Poll Hub, we're starting off a little local, and then we're going big. First up, our brand new poll of New Yorkers and how the Empire State feels about our new governor, Kathy Hochul, and how we feel about our former governor, Andrew Cuomo. We'll look at the data to see what it shows. Then, depending on where you live and what news organizations you follow, there's a crisis in K-12 education, or not. We're talking with the author of a fascinating new study about public schools in America in the age of COVID mandates and the new culture wars that are descending on formerly sleepy school boards. And then grab your grain bowl for Lee's fun fact. What the heck? Let's get to it. And hi everybody, welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Merengoff.
So we are talking a little bit closer to home today. We've taken a step back from some of our national polling, and we dug deep into how Kathy Hochul, governor of New York State, is doing statewide and what New Yorkers think about her. We didn't expect the Governor Hochul to be a household name, but actually we're somewhat surprised. She has an approval rating overall of 49%, and that doesn't sound, too much of a blockbuster, as one of our colleagues would say. Initially, 49% just kind of sounds meh, to quote Mike Conti. But her disapproval is only 31%, which means she's plus 18 points. And that's a big deal these days when most people don't think either the state or the country is going in the right direction. What that means, though, is that 1 in 5 New Yorkers didn't weigh in. They're unsure about how to rate her. And plus, there's a lot more to this story as well. We asked a good number of questions about how she's doing in different areas, and we asked about the guy who made her lieutenant governor and why she's governor now. So, guys, what's the rest of the story?
Well, that's a real setup there, but former Governor Andrew Cuomo is not held in high esteem by New Yorkers. We asked whether people around the state want him to run again for governor. 77% said no, and that included 74% among Democrats. Clearly, there would be a Democratic primary with a crowded field, one would suspect, and a whole bunch of folks would not be eager to see him try to get that hard to get, if you haven't resigned, elusive fourth term. Jay, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things that stand out to me about this in terms of Hochul and Cuomo. Hochul's been in office 50 days as of Tuesday. It's 52 days as we record this. And lieutenant governors in New York are generally not well known because they generally have nothing to do. One of them famously refused to stay on the ticket a few decades back because there was nothing to do. So he was bored and he said, I'm not doing it. So this is a rare thing that a lieutenant governor would become governor, although it has also happened in the last decade.
Well, it's become, I was about to say, it's become more frequent of late.
It has been a bit more frequent, but I think what's surprising here is that she's doing as well as she's doing, plus 18, and only 1 in 5 New Yorkers are unsure of her performance because they presumably don't know much about her. I think that's actually pretty remarkable for somebody who, well, she has been lieutenant governor for a long time, it is never in the news.
Jay, if I could just go on that, is that the unsure is a good number for her because she's getting 49% approval rating with 20% jury still out. So
right.
She doesn't have to get too many of those folks to break, obviously, into a majority. But I just
right.
Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. And in terms of Cuomo, I think it's just not a surprise that more than 3 in 4 New Yorkers don't think he should run again, including basically 74% of Democrats. I just don't think this is a surprise because what we discovered in August when he decided to finally resign is this is a guy who has no friends. He just doesn't have friends. And I think New York voters, New York adults, I think they perceive that. And he has no friends in the New York electorate, it seems like, either.
There are a couple things that I did want to point out because when we do approval ratings, since this is a poll geek kind of conversation, we ask the approval rating a number of different ways. What we are moving towards is just an approve, disapprove question, asking about how people think the office holder is doing, and it allows us to compare the governor in New York State to the governor in other states and the president, because it's a very common way of measuring approval ratings. In the past, we had asked a question about whether, on a different scale, whether people thought that the governor was doing an excellent, good, fair, or poor job, and a 4-point scale. And I think what was really interesting is on that measure, where we combine the excellent and goods to be kind of a binary comparison to approve, Hochul has 37% among adults and 39% among registered voters. What was really interesting is we dug down into the people who rated her as fair. And of those, almost a third of New Yorkers who gave her a fair rating, and I think perhaps in New York, what we find is that fair is actually a good thing. If you're having a fair day, things are not bad. 48% of those New Yorkers actually also approve of the job that she's doing. So on that scale, even though it looks a lot more conservative and she is not doing as well, it still reinforces the fact that she is doing well in the eyes of New Yorkers so far. 56% also think she's a good leader for the state. What I also found interesting was that her numbers on things like COVID and the economy were very similar to what Governor Cuomo's ratings were before the, as we like to say, the recent unpleasantness that he had in August and the pretty significant scandal that caused him to resign. How much of an issue is that for her going forward? She was clearly lieutenant governor. She is the first woman governor of New York, but is she going to run into trouble in opponents who are likely to challenge her for the Democratic nomination because she was basically Cuomo's lieutenant governor?
Well, to Jay's point, though, lieutenant governors aren't that important a force as lieutenant governors. I think vice presidents are a little bit more tied to presidents these days than lieutenant governors are tied to governors. So I think these numbers suggest that she's established herself in her own right as governor. And I think particularly if Andrew Cuomo were to run, clearly she's then very separate from him.
Well, we did ask that. We did ask that.
Yeah. And I think in the toss-up questions when we asked, right now she's in front, both with and without Cuomo in the race. It's a double-digit lead, which is okay, but not overwhelming. It's still ways to go. Obviously, the field hasn't formed yet. But I think the numbers all point to the fact that she is the governor. And I think she's made the right moves so far.
Hey, Lee, I just want to get something from you on this, because our interns that work in our program, looked through the poll and they pulled out something that's really interesting on this leadership question and a big gender divide. 63% of New Yorkers that were women agreed she's a good leader for New York. 47% of men, still a plurality, but 47%. So a big gender gap there. And I'm just wondering, when you look at the potential 2022 race, she may be running against Letitia James, the Attorney General, Tish James, who is obviously a woman and who would be a formidable force.
In the primary.
It just strikes me that, in a primary, just strikes me that there's something to talk about here about women in New York, especially considering why Cuomo resigned.
Yeah, and I think that gender gap was seen both on her favorable, unfavorable, her handling of the pandemic, whether she's changing Albany for the better. We saw that throughout the numbers. I think that's where the mobilization is within the Democratic Party. I don't think you have a problem right now if you're doing better among women, because that's where the energy is. And so I think right now she's sitting where she needs to be.
And let's switch gears here. We want to talk to a guest who we've had on the show before, who does some really interesting research, and I think you're really going to find what we're talking about here fascinating. Let's welcome back Dan Cox. He is the director of the Survey Center on American Life at AEI, that's the American Enterprise Institute. Dan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
You have done a fascinating study or survey that digs into public education in America, but that's a little too broad. There's a couple of things we really looked at in there that we think are really interesting. One is the attitudes from parents with school-age kids and non-parents about a bunch of different things about COVID. And then the other is on curriculum and textbooks and stuff that's in the news a lot lately because of this new battleground, maybe not a new battleground, but the revived battleground in what we teach, American kids. Let's start with the COVID stuff. What surprised you in what you found, and maybe give us some of the numbers as well?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is really important to realize when you're looking at how Americans think about mask requirements and vaccine mandates for schools is, by and large, they're fairly popular. And you do see a familiar partisan divide with Democratic parents very supportive of those things, Republican parents less so. But there's a really important education divide through all this stuff as well, where college-educated parents are far more supportive of stricter requirements, that administrators and teachers and students who are eligible should all be vaccinated. And parents without a college education are much less sure about those things. And so you see both a partisan divide in this stuff and an educational one too.
Yeah, the numbers, just to put something, just a couple things to put some numbers onto this. You asked about the percentage of Democrats and Republicans who say that public schools need to have all students, staff, teachers, everybody wearing a mask. 89% of Democrats agreed with that, 34% of Republicans. That's as stark a partisan divide, I think, as we see, right?
Yeah, and I think if you sort of watch some of the debate and you've sort of tuned into some of the protests that we've seen over the country and the concerns that certain parents seem to have about wearing masks, right? I think that's really interesting. Like, my kids started wearing masks when they were like 2.5, and like 4, and they've been wearing them for like 18 months. My youngest has been wearing a mask in daycare for like almost half his life. And so a lot of this stuff is I think not explicitly about sort of the health issues, but I think it's sort of, it's turned into a kind of like a sort of tribal identity, right? Like that to be for it means to be on one team, and to be against it means to be on another team. Because you don't see this when you ask questions about vaccinations more broadly. So like measles, mumps, rubella, we asked a question about that, and you see pretty high numbers of both Republicans and Democrats supportive of vaccine requirements for those kind of childhood illnesses. And so it's really the COVID-19 vaccine and sort of related protocols where you do see this really intense partisan split.
Yeah, Dan, I thought it was really interesting because of the anti-vaxxer sentiment, which we hear so much about, and then it seems to be a relative commitment based on what the vaccine has in it, whereas this one seemed to become much more political football. That's part of the other ones are normal. I mean, that's part of having a vaccine as a kid grows up. So I thought that was interesting. The anti-vaxxer thing is not solid on all vaccines.
Right. And if you're, I like to think of myself as a guarded optimist. And so I think, there's a chance that we could actually get to a place where it doesn't become such a political football, doesn't become so politically contentious, that it becomes more routinized as people get more familiar with it and the science behind it, we can get the talking heads and political leaders all on the same page. I think that we have an opportunity to get COVID-19 vaccines where we are with other types of vaccines, and we may well need to, because COVID-19 may not be going anywhere.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found interesting, which we did see in some of our polling as well, is that non-parents were actually more concerned about children not being vaccinated and not wearing masks than parents. Do you have any insights as to what's behind those attitudes?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, right? Because you would expect at least that the parents would be most concerned. But when it comes to transmission, right, you see that non-parents are more worried about children getting infected and kind of spreading it throughout the community. Parents tend to be a little bit less concerned than you might expect. But I think like one of the things that has been apparent is that the news that children were going to be less vulnerable to this disease, I think was internalized really early on. And I think that has really, as people have tried to assess the level of risk with the new Delta variant, it's been really difficult. The communication is, from CDC, from FDA, has been sometimes inconsistent or conflictual. And so I think it's been difficult to make decisions to try to update your information. So I think part of the reason is that one piece of information, oh yeah, children are basically going to be okay, is playing a role. I mean, the other thing to say is that parents, I think, are demographically probably a little bit more conservative than non-parents. That group is, I think tends to be a little bit younger and more politically liberal too. So I think there's some demographic issues as well behind it.
One of the other things, and again, I want to reiterate this study, there's a lot in here, and I encourage all of our listeners to go into the show notes and click on the link to read this entire thing. It's an easy read. It's not like super academic, but there's a lot here. One of the other things you looked at is curriculum textbooks, and we've heard a lot about this in terms of kind of the culture wars. Talking about how you teach things like slavery or Japanese internment, how you talk about white privilege and all of that. A couple things stood out, but one in particular was when you were asking about this, at least to me, one of the things that really stood out was that there was very little partisan divide when you were up high, at the high level. So 92% of Democrats and 86% of Republicans said that the textbooks should cover how the government forcibly removed Native Americans from the land. So we're in agreement. But then when you start getting down into the weeds about how you teach these things, the partisan divides just open up just as wide as ever. Were you surprised by that finding? And is that an accurate statement of what you found?
Yeah, and I think this kind of captures what I would say is the sort of the 20,000 foot kind of takeaway from the report, is that we have in some ways surprising amounts of consensus, but we have an enduring division as well. So on these sort of fact-based questions, like whether some of the founders who owned slaves, that should be acknowledged in textbooks, whether the federal government's role in creating Japanese internment during World War II, treatment of Native American peoples, as you mentioned, like there's bipartisan agreement that this stuff ought to be included. But when you get at the priorities, right, whether these things should be taught or like how important are they that students learn these things, you have really different, as you mentioned, sort of like a widening of the gap between Republicans and Democrats. And other contemporary issues like climate change, things about the role of racial discrimination in U.S. history, right? You see really large differences between the extent to which Democrats versus Republicans prioritize that. Democrats say yes, Republicans say it's much less important. And religious liberty issues, benefits of free market capitalism, the role of Christianity in America's founding, those are higher priorities for Republicans than Democrats.
You're talking about like the 20,000 foot level. Your title is Director of the Survey Center on American Life. This is quite an extensive survey. What do you think it says about American life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I
think that's more than 20,000 feet, Barb. I think you went up to about 30.
30,000, 30. But we don't want to go into orbit. But I just found this, very interesting. And there's just a lot of caveats in all of this data. Some of it's surprising, some not. But I was just really interested in what your overall, takeaway from this is.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for a lot of us, living through the past, 18, 20 months has been extraordinarily difficult, both thinking sort of the public health, sort of the personal challenges that many of us are facing, the political challenges that we've had. And I think that some of this, I think, points to kind of a more promising place that we can end up, right? That we can agree on some of the facts, that some of these kind of age-old debates that we've been having, we're coming to a more of a consensus around issues of race and gender. But on more emerging issues, when you talk about white privilege, Black Lives Matter, that there's more disagreement on, that people feel strongly about it. And I think there will continue to be debates about this stuff. One of the things that we wrote after this report, we looked at the kind of the role of LGBTQ issues in public schools. And there's still, I think there's a sense that a lot of these things have been, we come to agreement, like same-sex marriage, I think is upwards of 70% public support. But when you look in the public school context, things are a little bit different. And I think, we have to realize that, when we talk about these broad issues, you can't just sort of say, hey, this one issue, this has this much support among the public versus that. But the details are really instructive. So for instance, like people are generally comfortable with a transgender or a gay and lesbian teacher teaching in elementary schools. People are more ambivalent about putting a pride flag in school and public schools. And so there's these kind of tensions there that, on one hand, people, don't want to be discriminatory, but there's some amount of, I think, trepidation and concern, particularly among conservatives, about anything that looks like it's endorsing maybe a political message.
Yeah, I find it interesting in your guarded optimism that you talked about earlier, that we're all kind of somewhat a victim of, we see numbers and they're very different. There's a big, there's an extremes on both sides. And you're also looking to the commonality, though, and you're looking to, Democrats might think this more than Republicans, but not all Democrats think that way. And some Republicans also do. So it's not like these are, 100 and zeros. I want to ask one other just quick thing on the tolerance relationship kind of questions. I assume age was a factor in all that. We see that in our day-to-day life, but I'm wondering nationally whether the survey revealed that as well.
Yeah, so like across these issues, we tend to see, younger people generally more supportive of whether it's a Black Lives Matter banner being put in school or a pride flag. They're more supportive of teaching about LGBTQ identity and experience in schools. And one of the things, actually, places where you see a really interesting generational divide is this view of patriotism, whether we should be instilling patriotism in schools. Overall, Americans are broadly supportive of the idea that students should learn to love their country and why. And younger Americans are far less likely to say that. They are more divided on whether this should be something that schools are doing. And I think one of the things that this tells me anyway is that for younger people, we can look at American history with a critical eye, that we don't have to gloss over some of the darker aspects of our culture and our history and still celebrate the country that we have. Now, I think those ideas can be in tension, and I think younger people are kind of wrestling with them. But I think overall, what you see among the public is that sort of willingness to weigh into these really fraught issues, but also, believe that people can still love their country maybe despite these things.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for coming on. The report is called, I don't think I actually gave you the whole title, Controversy and Consensus, Perspectives on Race, Religion, and COVID-19 in Public Schools. And Dan is the director of the Survey Center on American Life at the AEI. And again, we'll put the links to this report, the survey, down in the show notes so that everybody has a chance to read it on their own. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Time to turn the page. It's fun fact time. Perhaps my highlight of the week, I think. Certainly not baseball or football. So
not in New York, right?
No, not my fun facts with that. But here we go with, I think, an interesting fun fact that was dug out of the Roper archives. Thinking about the people that you know, do you have a close friend or family member who is a vegetarian? This is, again, people you know. And we got a poll that was done in 2012. by PRRI, found in the Roper Archives, 38% say, yeah, they got a close family friend, a family member or friend who is a vegetarian. Pretty healthy number.
And actually 6% self-identified as well. So that gets added to that 38 to 44%.
Yeah, so lots of folks know someone who is a vegetarian. And that's kind of interesting and a healthy statistic.
But then we dug a little
Yeah,
further.
what did you find when you dug?
So we went back to 1943 to a Gallup poll when they were, knocking on doors and talking to people face to face. And at that time, they asked, "Are you a vegetarian? Anybody in your household? And for what reason?" And a combined 3% of people said they're vegetarians. Yeah, 1943, 3% vegetarians. And then Barb, 2019, you looked at a poll, and what did that show?
Yeah, and I find it really amazing. 3% identified as vegan, and 5% identified as vegetarian. And I don't believe those are exclusive categories. So you could have identified as a vegetarian and also as vegan. So I think it's really interesting. Now, certainly the population in the United States has grown quite significantly since 1943. So there are, in fact, a great number more of Americans who do not eat meat for one reason or another, but it's still about the same proportion of the country. I found that really fascinating.
Very surprising. And look, folks, we're nothing if we're not hung up about question wording. Jay, one of the things that you found in the 1943 poll was they weren't actually calling them vegetarians. They were calling them.
No, I think they did call them vegetarian. I actually didn't have. Sorry, I
Oh,
didn't
they
have
did.
I didn't have that up. I actually closed that.
I thought the category was people who don't eat
Well,
meat.
they couched it in "Do you not eat meat?" Otherwise known as a vegetarian. Yeah, but then what they were really getting at was, why don't you eat meat? Is it for health reasons? Is it because you don't like the taste? That was one of the options, or you just don't. You're just not going to eat meat. And those three each represented 1%. And in those days, they did a big end size. It was 2,500 doors they knocked on. They talked to a lot of people. So 1% actually represented a fair number of people.
Yeah, absolutely. But what's interesting is today, I think we would see a lot of different reasons as well. And then polls that have tried to understand and get a sense of what's important to people when they choose not to eat meat. Yes, health is a big reason, but also animal welfare. And I think it's interesting that in the past, that probably wasn't something that crossed people's mind, that people really, did not want to eat animal meat. And then there are also religious reasons and many others as well. But I think we've broadened. If we haven't broadened the proportion of people who eat this kind of life, have this kind of lifestyle, and choose to eat in this way, we certainly have broadened the discussion and the acceptance of talking about it.
And if I didn't eat meat, I would starve to death. But I'm not in the crowd of the 3 to 5%.
Hey, and before we let you go, just another reminder that Poll Hub is going live. It is happening on Wednesday, October 20th at 7 o'clock Eastern. We're doing Poll Hub live. The point is to give you guys a chance to join in the fun and engage with us. We'd love to take your questions, and we'll be doing an episode with a lot of really interesting topics. We're putting the information in the show notes. So, set an alert, mark your calendar, do whatever you need to do to remember that Wednesday, October 20th at 7 p.m., that's when Poll Hub is going live. The link is in the show notes. You click on that at 7 o'clock on Wednesday night, and you will be joining Poll Hub live. We're looking forward to seeing you then. That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Ashley Marcinik and Marcello Bettman.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other like-minded listeners find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions, tweet them to us at Marist Poll.
Finally, however, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there's a subscribe button.
Click it and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.